Good evening, everyone. Fantastic to see so many faces, particularly so many new faces. On behalf of the American Swiss Foundation and the Young Leaders Alumni Foundation, a very warm welcome. It's the 17th edition of this fantastic event in a fantastic venue. Unfortunately, the weather is not on our side. That's something that is, even for us, outside of our control. With almost 200 participants, this is over twice the number of last year. We are sold out, first time for this event. And what is in particular great is that we have, as I said, so many new faces, people who heard of the organization, of the great things that we are doing. And we are very grateful and thankful for your support and for attending tonight. And we obviously encourage you to attend many more events along the year. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. There is many more things to come during this year and in the forthcoming year. I'm stepping in for Bettina Schaller, who's actually the president of the Young Leader Alumni Foundation, our fearless leader. She is currently in the US, in Washington, and sends her best regards. So she is the embodiment of what this organization represents. It's building bridges between our sister republics. I would also like to take the opportunity to say thank you, a big thank you to Swiss Re for hosting us again this year here in beautiful Rüschlikon, but also in particular this year for hosting the Young Leader Conference, and this is the third time. So again, we could not do it without you. And the same goes for Swiss International Airlines, who's been flying participants of the Young Leaders Conference for so many years across the Atlantic. Again, thank you very much. Fly Swiss. And for the young leaders among us, I myself am an alum of the class 2003, the best class ever, of course. We are all very well aware how fortunate we are to be part of such an amazing organization. I think the fact that we remain, fully engaged and connected over all these years is the best tribute to what this organization stands for. Namely, as I said, building bridges between the sister republics, but in particular, building friendships that last for a lifetime. Before we move to the official part, one very important point is that we will all have the opportunity to gather in the forum afterwards, to continue the dialogue, to make new friends, and do that in the typical Swiss manner with an apéro. So please join us after the program. And it is now my great pleasure to hand over to Markus Diethelm, Chair of the Swiss Advisory Council and co-chair of the American Swiss Foundation, who will moderate a fireside chat with Ulrich Brechbühl, who you will present in more detail. Sorry, that's my clutch. Introducing Markus, so that we pay enough tribute to him, would take the better part of the evening. So I will keep it very, very short. While Sergio Emotti, past and current CEO of UBS, is known as the George Clooney of Swiss bankers, Markus, who has a very distinguished career as general counsel, a member of executive boards of Swiss Re, so for you this is the homecoming game, to UBS, to Credit Suisse, and now somehow back to UBS. Well, Markus is known as the James Bond of Swiss banking for his ability to solve impossible missions. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause for Ulrich Brechbühl and Markus Diethelm.
Thank you, Michael. I can only disappoint now with all these expectations. I'm going to introduce Ulrich Brechbühl, a graduate from West Point and Harvard Business School. I know that the Harvard Club of Switzerland has a number of people who are here this evening. He was in section E for excitement. And in his role as the counselor to the Secretary of State Pompeo, he was chartered with offering strategic guidance on foreign policy. He is not a politician. Consequently, he's never been burdened to run a campaign. He wouldn't know how to run a campaign. He went about the organization of the State Department in his role as if it were a business. And he got things done. And I observe more and more, there used to be a time when politicians were actually decision makers, focusing on governance, focusing on setting the right policy, and then a few weeks or months before the next election, they became politicians. And now we live in a world where they happen to be on some sort of an election campaign 24/7. And the modus operandi in the fast-moving media attention to claim the highest number of likes, to claim statements of popularity, oftentimes produces the wrong results. Ulrich will make his introductory remarks, including, of course, the very important component of where he actually came from, what he did on Gurnigelberg or Gürbental or Kirchberg and Tockenburg. You'll be surprised how familiar he is with Switzerland. And I trust you will find his remarks highly practical and inspiring. Most refreshingly, incredibly personal. I was inspired by hearing Ulrich in past speeches, and I believe we don't only share the same middle name, Ulrich, but we also have some other values in common. I try to lead with yes. Success comes from doing. I do not let failure ever define who I am, because failure is never the end of the story. And authenticity and truth is everything. And someone famously said, not me, I repeat it, a measure of a person is how to make a success with who they are. Some of you heard me saying at other events that as a lawyer, I have one of the most basic job descriptions there are. All I do is to interpret the meaning of words in the English language. And according, of course, to precedent law and according to adapting changes in interpretation. I try to think creatively and solve problems intelligently. But what does this mean in today's world? I actually came back yesterday from a week at USC, where one of our daughters graduated at the School of Cinematic Arts and Politics, Philosophy and Law, and heard very many brilliant people, but also heard some warning signals by the president of the USC, especially on AI and the flood of information that is coming our way. This year's Oscar-winning Best Picture was Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. I have to admit, and there's someone in the room, that I had to leave the movie because I couldn't follow it. I wasn't fast enough, or I wasn't confused enough. But the film was a mind-bending exercise, but one that reflects the tenor of our times. A contemporary life moving at warp speed, fast and furious. USC Center of Generative Art and Society explores the impact of artificial intelligence on culture, education, media, and society. And they openly stated the risks it may create in misinterpretation and creating political bias. I didn't know that 90% of all data, digital data, has been created in just the last 2 years. So you can only imagine how fast it is going. And the commencement speech by Carol Folt, the president of the USC, did caution the speed of the development of artificial intelligence. And the class of 2023 was also helpfully reminded that counterfeit gold only exists because gold exists. And creativity and ability to solve problems intelligently is something that resides in our brains, in the human capacity. So it is for us all to find our own authenticity and truth. Ulrich will explain his very own version to that. As I said at the beginning, I found it very refreshing that he came into the State Department not having a clue how the State Department functions, but applied everything he knew, which was how to run a business. And went about it in a way that he will point out his successes. I think it is incredibly important today to guard our own truth and authenticity by believing what we actually can believe and not that which is pushed upon us, which is just the world we live in. I had the great pleasure to meet him at a dinner at the residence, the U.S. Embassy, with Ambassador McMullen, who can't be here tonight, who sends his apologies. And I know that he will, in the same unguarded, Ulrich himself, what he believes, tell us his experience. We will then do a fireside chat, and there'll be questions in the end. Don't hold back with questions because he will answer every single one of them. So with that, Ulrich, the floor is yours, and I'll sit down, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Co-Chair, for that incredibly gracious invitation. It's a real pleasure to be back here in Switzerland, see so many old friends and new friends, and have the opportunity to address a group here that does so much to support and strengthen the bilateral relationship between the United States and Switzerland. When the invitation was extended, I was very quick to accept because as I looked at the calendar, not only could I make it happen, but I also realized I was going to be able to bring two of my sons who happened to just have finished school years, one finishing his master's and the other finishing his junior year of his bachelor's, and come back and visit some of our family places back here in Switzerland. And so we spent the last 2 days in the Toggenburg, Ville St. Gade, on the farm that I used to spend a lot of time on growing up. Every other summer I was there, and my parents figured if they sent me from the US to Switzerland to work on a farm, I'd stay out of trouble. And so, so I have to get up early and be tired after the day. And so we spent the last 2 days there visiting family, and then the next 3-4 days we're going to go to the Gürbetal, as Markus mentioned, where my dad was from, and have a chance to hopefully go up the Stockhorn if the weather's good, go to the top of the Niesig, Gurnegelua, and so looking forward to it. It's wonderful to be here. Growing up in Switzerland, I was always the American, and in the US, I was always the Swiss. So since we're in Switzerland, obviously speaking in English. You have seen the basic bioelements, and so I appreciate the disclaimer that Markus provided. I might add a little bit to that, because I really consider myself, my roots, to be a Swiss farm boy. Both my parents grew up on little family farms, and as I said, made sure that was part of what we experienced growing up, my 2 brothers and my 1 sister. I then turned into an American soldier, an officer in the US Army, served up on the Iron Curtain, and then turned into a businessman, a US businessman. See a number of my HBS classmates here, and they know it was quite a transition for me out of the rigored world of the military into the business world. As Markus said, I believe in straight speak. I don't know how to sort of obfuscate real well, which was interesting because a lot of folks at the State Department are very good at that. And so my comments this evening are not intended in any way, shape, or form to offend anybody, but really to just reflect my own personal perspectives and experiences. To that extent, when it comes to questions, there may be something I say, look, I just really fundamentally don't know. I will tell you that, and we'll move on and move to something that I might be able to add a little value. Looking forward to the discussion. Before we do, I thought that there would be really 3 topics that I might address that would make the discussion in the Q&A session a little bit more meaningful. The first one is to talk about the role of the counselor. The second is to provide some comments about US foreign policy, really at a top level, and what President Trump and those of us that served in his administration were trying to do. And then last but not least, really how that team approached the bilateral relationship with Switzerland. So let me start off with the role. For those of you that took a good look at the invitation, it said the 33rd counselor. So obviously there were 32 before me. The counselor, by the way, is not a legal role, so that we had a legal counsel. The counselor truly is that sort of an advice giver, if you will, and I'll explain the background. But being the 33rd, some of the ones that came before me, folks, you might recognize names. George Kennan, he of the long telegram, who warned the West about the need to contain the Soviet Union at the time. Douglas MacArthur III, and more recently a dear friend of mine who just passed away last year, Colonel Robert McFarlane, who eventually then was the National Security Advisor for President Reagan as well. So where did the role come from? What is the counselor? May not be a huge surprise to folks, but you probably don't think about it often. Up until the late 1800s, the U.S. Secretary of State never actually traveled outside the confines of the U.S. The first trip was made in the late 1800s, second trip was made in the early 1900s. And about that time, somebody said, well, what happens, because of course you're traveling by steamboat, what happens if and you didn't have cell phones, satellites, what have you, what happens if the secretary's out of the country? And so folks decided that, you know what, we need to have somebody who could stand in the place. And so the counselor role was created. And so for a couple of years, the counselor served as the number 2 at the department. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. government reorganized and sort of set a standard structure. And so you had a secretary, a deputy secretary, and then undersecretaries. And the State Department chose to not do away with the counselor role, instead make it an undersecretary level role, the responsibilities of which were defined by the secretary. So that's what it is still today. Given my 40-year history with Secretary Pompeo, he and I were plebes at West Point together, went through West Point, served in the Army, then went back to graduate school. He was on the lawyer side at Harvard Business School. I was on the south side of the river. And then we started a business a bit later. Once we had paid off our school debt, we, for 4 or 5 years, ran and built an aerospace business together. So I've known him an awfully long time. And I guess probably because of that, that was the reason he asked me to come to DC to help him. But because of that, I got a lot of cleanup assignments. And so I will list a couple of the areas that I ended up touching on and not go into any detail, but simply they may provide a little bit of food for some of the questions down the road. So I ended up having to be the State Department lead on the illegal immigration crisis that we have in the United States. When President Trump said he wanted to buy Greenland without having talked to the team, Mike said, Brex, you got to go deal with that fire. So I spent a lot of time in Greenland and Denmark. I got to deal with the China challenge in the Western Hemisphere, so made many trips to Latin America. Something that's probably near and dear to most people in this room, we had a WIPO election that you may remember in early 2020. The results of that, or the prognosis for that, in January 2020 were looking horrible. And so Mike said, Brex, you got to go spend time in Geneva and figure this out. Thankfully, we had a great team and were able to work closely with allies and friends around the world and change that. We had a real staffing problem when the secretary got there. About 15 months into the administration, literally 60% of the team was not yet in place, leadership team. And so I spent the first 4 months really interviewing people. Got the assignment to rework the culture, assignment to, which was turned into a development of a professional ethos, the assignment to figure out how to get the KXL pipeline, the oil pipeline in the United States that was supposed to be under construction, how to get that properly permitted. And then last but not least, something I didn't see coming was, as you know, the Trump administration was very focused on strengthening our abilities in space and coordinating the efforts. And that, of course, required someone at a senior level in the department to interface with the White House and the interagency, and so I got to do that, which is pretty cool. It also, sort of being cleanup also meant that whenever we lost a key player, I ended up having to fill the role until I could get it filled full time. And so we ended up losing our person who had been acting Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy. And so for the better part of a year, I ended up having to fill that role. Truly unique. Every day was an adventure. Give you an idea, I started off about 6 a.m. with the Presidential Daily Brief, the PDB. And then about 6:45, hopefully I digested most of that and went into a meeting with the Secretary and 3 other close teammates. And from there, then the day set off. I told folks it started at 6, and usually by 9 o'clock in the morning, my plan for the day was already blown up because something somewhere had gone south, and so it was really interesting. Enough about that role, though. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. Let's talk about the second topic for a moment, and that is a perspective on U.S. foreign policy post-World War II. If you go count it up, there have been 14 presidential administrations, and despite dramatically different world situations, economic environments, there's really a number of things that have been very consistent in the first 11 of those administrations. You know, supporting and defending freedom and democracy worldwide, support for the rule of law, human rights, free markets and capitalism, entrepreneurship, innovation. It was also during that period, it was unquestioned that the U.S. would almost single-handedly guarantee Western Europe's freedom. As time went on, that was despite rapidly growing European wealth and prosperity. And then when the century changed and we started to have the rise of China and Chairman Xi, particularly in the Obama administration, we started to have some, continue to, maybe aggravated some of the challenges that the U.S. had faced. Our deficits got larger and larger. We started to lose more and more jobs. The economy was under tremendous duress, and we literally, I'll use a term that don't mean it to be inflammatory, but when you realize that it's 10 times the size of the United States Army that comes across illegally on our southern border, I think it is best described as an invasion that we have in the South. Not only a human invasion, but frankly of drugs and other challenges. I described that scenario because a growing number of Americans were getting fed up with the domestic situation. You here in Europe all know it was during that time frame that Russia started to become expansionist again, invaded Crimea. Iran's proxies and extremists started to set off bombs, and terrorist attacks in Belgium, for example, became commonplace. And the world was really on edge. Enter Donald Trump at that point, who acknowledged the struggles to the American people that we were having and pledged really to address them, not only domestically, but internationally. His foreign policy really committed to the same tenets that I described earlier, but he really had a different way and a different thought process about how to implement and support them. And I'd like to just sort of go through the list of things that we talked about every time a decision came up. How are we doing this? First was putting the American people and our national security, both physical and economic, first in all our deliberations. The fundamental belief being that a strong America is good for freedom and democracy worldwide. Secondly, obviously, standing up for democracy in all forms of freedom, to include religious freedom. Dealing with the world, and this is one thing I think was a significant departure from the past, dealing with the world in a very realistic fashion, the way it was, not the way we wished it would be. I think there have been many times where people have sort of said, well, we wish it was like this, and then they pretend that it is, as opposed to dealing with the core issues. So in return for having that sort of realistic way of looking at it, we decided we needed to implement policies to shape it to be the way we wanted it to be. And to that end, to use power and leverage where possible, really to reestablish the deterrence model that President Reagan had made so popular in his efforts to end the Cold War, really focusing back on peace through strength. We committed to imposing real costs on bad actors for 2 reasons: 1, to prevent, and 2, to punish bad behavior. The last thing really that was a standout that we talked about on a regular basis was committing the United States to a course that ensured energy independence and to use our energy independence in an aggressive fashion on the international stage. So I mentioned a number of things there. Part of number 3, for example, dealing with the world in a realistic fashion, was really to recognize a rapidly growing threat that Chairman Xi and the Chinese Communist Party presented to the Western world. The focus, obviously, and those of you that obviously in this room have lived through that know that our administration did not focus on being liked. Previous administrations maybe came and told people what they wanted to. Our administration said, look, we got to deal with the world the way it is, or things are not going to change. And so we had very hard, tough, candid conversations. We pushed Europe to decrease energy reliance on Russia. As many of you know, fought a long battle to try to prevent Nord Stream 2 from being completed. We felt that bypassing Ukraine would help impoverish Ukraine, help enrich Russia, and was not in the West's best interest in any way, shape, or form. We pushed hard to try to convince people not to do the short term, and here talking against a little bit of the business perspective, to not do the short-term business and politically expedient things, focusing on short-term profits, but to really make sure we understood the Chinese challenge and that we reduced our economic dependence on China. We already were concerned about supply chains and things like that. And then the last thing that you're probably very familiar with was we made a conscious effort to ask the Europeans to live up to previously made defense commitments that, frankly, Europe as a whole had laughed off for the better part of 20, 30 years. There's a number of meetings I remember sitting in when we had very frank conversations. One was with a European country I won't mention. You can maybe take a guess where, they were woefully behind their 2% Wales commitment. And I remember Mike looking at the Prime Minister and saying, really need you to step up. And the Prime Minister sort of demurred and, well, our people really like social spending, et cetera. And Mike just looked at him and said, there's a lot of people in Appalachia who would like to have more social spending. And we're spending at that point in time 4.5% of our GDP. And they don't understand why it can't at least be met with your 2% commitment. So had very frank conversations, didn't endear us to anybody, but I think as you start to look back at what's ensued, you realize that it was critical. I think if NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg were here, he would probably say that one of the most influential and meaningful sort of players on behalf of NATO in the last, probably 20, 30 years was President Trump and his insistence that NATO sort of re-examine itself. Any rate, you get an idea, if you will, of sort of the focus that we had. Now, if you go back and take a look, I'd like to just sort of highlight what I think generally the results were. We focused on deregulation, releasing America's entrepreneurial and innovative spirit, and the economy, frankly, was booming until COVID hit in 2020. We had not had an unemployment rate as low as that in many, many decades. Energy prices incredibly low, rapidly growing jobs environment, virtually no inflation, tremendous growth in the equity markets. We rebuilt our defense capabilities. Many of you remember ISIS. Well, we made that thing a thing of the past. We eliminated the pressure that was causing massive amounts of migration into Europe. No new wars were started. In fact, in the Middle East, we had a little peace breakout with the Abraham Accords. Russia and the Middle Eastern regimes lost power, wealth, and strength. Iran was held in check. There were no bombings, no terrorist bombings during that time frame. And frankly, North Korea, not a single ICBM test or launch. It's obviously controversial when the US got out of the Paris Accords, but if you go back and take a look, because of what we were doing with liquid natural gas, the US actually, while no longer signatory, actually decreased CO2 emissions from the US as the economy was growing. Not a single European country did that in that same time frame. All talk. We were focused on, as Markus highlighted earlier, business results and action. As we all know the story, razor-thin majority of the American people ended up then electing President Biden, who really decided to fundamentally tack away from the Trump policies. we all saw what happened. Energy prices soared, inflation got its legs, the illegal immigration problem sprang up, and now it's 3 times as bad. Russia invaded Ukraine, mass refugee situation again in Europe, power shortages. I never would have thought Germany would increase the amount of coal used to, but obviously had to, so very challenging. China has been unleashed, and in many ways now threatening Taiwan in a way that none of us would have ever mentioned. Iran pursuing nuclear weapons, and the DPRK launching missiles and issuing threats regularly. The contrast is pretty stark. So just wanted to sort of set the stage as we have some of the conversations then for sort of what we were trying to do. Last topic I wanted to touch on quickly before starting the discussion is how we approach the bilateral relationship. And I think first I need to say that we were incredibly blessed with a great set of Swiss partners and colleagues to work with, both in Washington, D.C. And in Switzerland. As I look around the room here, I see a few of them, and I'm thrilled that they've honored us with their presence this evening. Ambassador Dahinden, Ambassador Peterloo and their respective staffs in D.C., and then Foreign Minister Cassis, represented here by General Secretary Seiler and his staff. Were just absolute professionals in every sense of the word. So what did we do on the American side? How did we approach it? Well, we sought to bring our best to the table as well. We were led here in Switzerland by Ambassador Ed McMullen and his very able team. Obviously, everyone who serves in a foreign country knows that you have a team back home helping you, and it was no different for Ed. Secretary Pompeo and our team at the State Department were front and center, but we had a lot of other folks. Ambassador Robert O'Brien, many of you know, he served as the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, worked very closely with Swiss diplomats as we tried to repatriate colleagues of ours that were unduly detained in bad places, and then served as a National Security Advisor. Senator Rob Portman, who has Swiss roots in Congress, was a stalwart, and then numerous others at Commerce, Secretary, at Treasury, and at Defense. Last but not least, I don't know if many of you know, but actually the Deputy NASA Administrator was a Swiss gentleman by the name of Thomas Zurbuchen. And so all these things going on at NASA, he was in charge of all of the missions. He was sort of on the mission side. So what I can say about that group of people that focused on the bilateral relationship was that all really deeply understood and respected the Swiss people, Swiss values, and Swiss history. They understood that the business of Switzerland is business. They genuinely respected the sovereignty and friendship of our sister republic, her people, and her leaders. And I think truly appreciated the unique position that Switzerland has on the world stage, the unique role that it can and does play in so many areas. And frankly, we welcome both of those. To a person, I think that group believed in transparency and open communications, and I think it showed. I think the vast majority of Swiss leaders at that point in time would tell you that they had complete, direct, and immediate access at all levels of the USG. Simply put, there was bilateral trust that existed, and I think the results speak for themselves. It was the first ever visit by the President of the Federal Council to the Oval Office, took place in that time frame. It dramatically increased Swiss FDI in the US. I think came from 7 or 8 all the way up to 5 or 6. Greatly increased trade tourism, deepened cooperation on the R&D front. I already mentioned repatriating Americans that have been detained. Those are but a handful, if you will, of the achievements that hallmark that. There's some, obviously, that we don't have time to go into. I'd be remiss if I didn't also say that we fell short in some areas, and probably the biggest area that frustrated us was that we didn't get an FTA in place. But maybe that's a topic for a question later on today. So with that, Mr. Co-Chair, should we start the conversation?
Thank you very much, Ulrich. Listening to you, it seems this was all easy. You got stuff done. You arrived on day number 1. You arrived in the State Department that was formally led by the formidable opponent of President Trump, Hillary Clinton. And I'm curious, is the first question, when you told me you went in and people came with a few inches of paper to support the decision, that you said anything you are not able to summarize on one page, or you don't know to speak off the paper and convince me through your own voice is not useful time for me to spend on. How did you deal with the massive cultural changes that you introduced? Not having grown up in this environment and being surrounded by many, many career bureaucrats. How did you instill the excitement of getting things done? How did you use your power of yes? How did you lead by yes in getting anything done in this environment?
That's a great question because, I mean, it was a challenge in an awful lot of ways. And, you know, we succeeded in some areas and not in others. You described sort of a seminal moment for me, and that was one day I mentioned sort of I ended up getting to serve as the undersecretary or acting undersecretary for public diplomacy for a while. And one day, Mike sent to me about a 2-inch thick memo having to do with the prognosis for the World Expo in Dubai, Expo 2020. And he looked at me and he had 2 questions written on it. He says, Brex, does this matter? Brex, should I care? And obviously it was way too thicker for him to read. So I went back, and about 2 hours later, I came to the conclusion the answer to question 1 was, yes, it matters. And because it matters, the answer to number 2 was, yes, you should care. But that really sort of, in my mind, the fact that a key leader was going to have his time taken by 2 inches worth of paper coming his direction with no clear summary that allowed him to very quickly cut to the chase. And so right then and there I said, folks, if you're coming in, if something's coming into my desk, if you can't concisely say, you know, I'll give you 5 to 6 slides even, but you got to understand your material well enough, much like I sort of had been taught at Bain, I guess, in my first foray into the business world. Being concise, having a business case, understanding the rationale, understanding the pros and cons were front and center. And so, you know, it's interesting. I think initially it was a real culture shock for people because they realized they had to learn something new. But frankly, it probably ended up being actually rewarding for them. And I've had a number of people say afterwards, they didn't have to spend nearly as much time. They spent a lot more time thinking about the logic and a lot less time doing the administrivia of creating reams of paper. They knew we weren't going to measure success on how heavy the paper was.
How big was the backlash of some of the very unpopular decisions by common perception, like not signing on to the Paris Agreement? It seemed from the outside looking at it that the administration didn't much care to explain it and just went on doing its business. And it goes back to my earlier comment in that we're too prone to say things that we perceive to be popular, that give us the necessary number of likes, that give us the applause. The way in which you went about things, other than, you know, the successes by going to North Korea and things that were obvious to every viewer, but things that were more complicated, how did you value the necessity or not of communicating this properly versus just getting on with producing results?
So I think fairly early on we realized you want to communicate, right? Ideally, it's a heck of a lot easier to push on an open door than on a closed door. And I think our gut instinct was to try to convince people and bring people along. Unfortunately, we were handicapped, and I'll use that term, by having a press that, even though we may have laid out the logic and the rationale, had no interest in carrying that message and saying, hey, here's the logic, here's the rationale, here's why. Instead, the first 6, 7 paragraphs, far further than the average reader would get, were focused on sort of the ideological reasons why it was bad. I think you can go back and look, and I don't think that any of the mainstream press ever acknowledged that U.S. CO2 emissions went down 2 years in a row, immediately following our departure from Paris.
And why is that? I mean, if you obviously, you know, the popularity of the president was such that people who didn't like him could never be convinced to like him. Very much the same as we currently see it. But the value of communication, once you see it doesn't find any traction, how do you go about it? What alternative channels are there? Rather than speaking from your own office, did you use, you know, partners around the world? We were talking about the phenomenal relationships with Switzerland. I think what Ambassador McMullen has done in the business community, traveling up and down the country and visiting every CEO of every company at least twice during his tenure, and becoming the spokesperson. How did you deal with the oftentimes noted, you know, absence of successfully communicating? What are the alternatives?
Yeah, so we very aggressively carried the message, and it may come as a surprise to some folks. Mike traveled almost twice as far, and myself, I probably traveled 3 times as far during COVID as we did in the year before COVID. And that was because we became convinced that there was no way you could carry the message for 5 or 10 minutes, talking into a TV camera or a computer camera, that you had to be front and center. And so if the message wasn't going to be echoed or carried and was going to be, in fact, contorted, our view was we had to go personally and make the case. And so I think, you know, during COVID, I spent time in Central America, Latin America, Europe, Africa. The only place I got a reprieve was Asia, but literally traveled probably 3 times as far as we did during the period beforehand.
Well, that's very, very comforting. I always was of the belief that you can't build a culture doing it on a screen in your home office. You need to have one-on-one persuasive efforts to convince people. Turning to the US-Swiss relations, could you summarize during your tenure what the key, you mentioned some of them, the key issues were? And of course, we're talking about the FTA, which unfortunately didn't come through. Just explaining how you went about it and how you compare your administration's policy with the one of the current administration, and if you could sort of rate the success or how it could be rescued in the end.
Yeah, so let me address the FTA situation, because that really we took that as a personal failure. I think everybody that was involved, because we felt that actually we had made some real progress. And I sort of think there's a number of key things you have to have. Each one sort of independently is a necessary condition, but independently is also insufficient condition for success. And so I think, you know, starts out with really having a compelling business case. What's the business case for having an FTA? What's going to change tomorrow? What's going to be better for the parties involved, et cetera? And I think that was fairly well built and fairly well understood. I think you end up, for having something like that come to fruition, you end up having to essentially have the right people. And those people really have to have sort of the right attitude and the right set of motivations to make it happen. And I'll explain in a second sort of the obstacles we were facing. And then third, I think you have to have the right set of conditions, whether it be a domestic political environment or geostrategic environment. The condition, you can't just be going totally upstream. And if you remember, you know, the Trump administration was incredibly economically focused. Almost everything, you know, if Secretary Pompeo were here, he would tell you, you know, more often than not, when he had a conversation with President Trump would turn to him and say, "Mike, who makes the money? Where's the money go? Follow the money. Help me understand how people are going to react and respond." And I would tell you that, you know, the whole challenge we had, you may remember NAFTA. The president had you know, run on the platform that he was going to replace NAFTA. So USMCA was a huge, you know, time sink for the trade Ambassador Lighthizer and his crew. We also, frankly, had the China challenge and having to renegotiate that whole relationship. And despite the fact that those two behemoths were hanging over our head, we were able to get the FTA on the radar, working very closely with, as I mentioned, the Swiss colleagues, and move that forward. I don't think that President Maurer at the time would have gotten the invitation, the opportunity to go to the Oval and have that had that not really been teed up. Quite frankly, from my vantage point, it all went south when the domestic political situation changed and impeachment number one started to take root, if you will, and people came transfixed on that. And all of a sudden, the effort, the momentum that we had, now, we weren't only trying to fight with other economic priorities. Now we were having to deal with the president's political survival, and we just couldn't get the team in the White House to push us hard anymore. So sort of those macro conditions changed.
No, I'm glad you mentioned attitude. I told my daughters early on, if you want to be successful in life, you need to score 5 points at each of the 3 components, which are you need to have a smart idea, you need to somehow sell it, and you need to have a good attitude while you're doing this. And the maximum score is then 125 points. If you have 0 score in attitude, it drops to only 25 points. And attitude is sort of free of choice when you get up in the morning and try to make a friendly face and approach the people in a positive way to achieve a result. And going back to some of the media coverage that we referred to earlier on, the underlying negative attitude towards almost anything that came out of the administration made people not even want to listen, it not being productive. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So on the investment development in the United States, there are obviously some tremendous results and figures that we can report on between Swiss and the Swiss and US relations. Swiss investors and companies across the United States. Do you see a shift towards states south of the Mason-Dixon line? Is that a trend that we can observe, and why?
Yeah. So investment is obviously was key to us, and I think is so key to the bilateral relationship. I mentioned earlier I spent a lot of time in Latin America, really trying to deal with the Chinese Communist Party influence and entry into really some of the countries there. And one of the things I was always asked when I would ask people and say, well, what can we do? How can we help, et cetera? And they'd say, Ulrich, we need more investment. We need American companies to come and invest. And then we'd have a conversation about that. And the conversation always had to do with, well, what's really the risk-free or the risk-adjusted return that you get on investment? And every time when we'd have the conversation and talk about it, it became clear that the companies were better off investing back home because it was just far more stable, didn't have all the risk involved. And I think what you see going on in the U.S. right now, yeah, there's, if you carve out a couple of industries, petrochemical, otherwise, the investment environment is still very good. What you see going on is a lot more investment taking place south of the Mason-Dixon line. I happen to be a resident and a citizen in Georgia now for the past 20 some odd years. And in that time frame, it's amazing how that has shifted. People want an environment that's business friendly, where there's a sense of stability and they understand that success is going to be rewarded. I mean, if you take a look at how many people some of the northern blue states have lost, or frankly, the westernmost blue state. I have a very close set of ties to Texas, both my wife's family and my son's there now, so we spend a lot of time there. And the amount of people that have moved from California, to Texas, and frankly, not for the climate, right? It's all because they perceive that there's freedom, they perceive they have control over their lives, and they perceive that there's an opportunity, a business opportunity that's far better. And so you see them. So I would say to Swiss companies or folks on this side of the pond looking, there's well-trained, labor force, people willing to learn, and very conducive economic conditions.
Provocatively, the deglobalization, what are some of the challenges and opportunities that deglobalization, specifically decoupling from China, presents to the US-Swiss relations? And do you buy into the Chinese narrative that it now is a game of technologically catching up with China instead of keeping ahead? And maybe one more sub-question. The Inflation Reduction Act and the EU's response with massive subsidies and renaissance of industrial policy and talk of trade wars does not bode well for a united West.
Yeah.
And will the countries that stick to the rules, and we're always a front runner as Swiss people to stick to the rules, lose out in that?
So there's a lot to unpack in that. I think the challenges that get posed is really gets driven by sort of long versus short-term, things. The challenge that we face with some of the activities of the Chinese Communist Party, those are long-term challenges. And I know I mentioned I spent a lot of time here in Europe during the administration. Probably half of the time was spent up in Germany trying to encourage the Germans not to finish Nord Stream 2, and secondly, to not become so reliant on China. And the big issue really that they always faced was, but look at what a big market is, look at the profits. And our conversation constantly came back, but folks, they don't share our values, and at some point in time, you are going to live to regret it. Short term, it may feel good, but long term, it's going to hurt. Little did we know COVID was going to come along, and short term hurt very quickly. So, I don't know how many folks in the room have read the, Michael Pillsbury's 100-Year Marathon, but that is a book certainly worth reading. He is somebody that has served for many years in all sorts of administrations, so totally, nonpartisan in that regard. And that book really is an expose, if you ever have a chance to talk to him, he'll be the first person to admit it, on mistakes that he and everybody else made 20 and 30 years ago with the way they approached the China relationship. But sort of the values or the value mismatch, if you will, that we have there. So that's a problem, because I think Europe is probably more willing to engage, not absolving sort of American companies at all, but I found very few European companies that were willing to sort of take a principled stand, that they seemed far more eager to just engage, damn the consequences. So that's a clear challenge. If you add up sort of the economies of the West, it's very clear that the only way that the West ends up, winning the battle in the long run is, Europe and North America sticking together. And so, you talk about the tariffs, and I know, the Inflation Reduction Act, it's an interesting misnomer, I guess, in many ways, because I think many people would say it has nothing to do with inflation. But things that make it difficult for the West to work together, are frankly challenges that we've got to overcome. And I think the only way you overcome that is by having conversations. And I think that's one of the things you asked a little bit about, sort of the current administration. I'm nowhere near plugged into DC anymore. I'm totally focused on private business endeavors, I guess with the exception of running one of the political action committees for my dear friend, former Secretary Pompeo. Let me see here. For heaven's sakes, I just lost my train of thought.
It's okay, but when you talk about China, and I referred to the movie that I walked out on, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and if you look at the sentiment, not just in the United States, that the voters hope for the return of less polarizing, more responsible politics, i.e. politics that has the capacity to please everyone all the time at the same time. This is obviously not what you have realistically put forward here. And the question is, the Swiss political system bears little resemblance to the American political system. But as a Swiss American, what do you make out of the US political system, where anything that comes across even remotely opinionated is not conducive to get common support. With that, you don't have any radical decisions, you don't have any radical discussions, you have a debate culture that is becoming incredibly averagarian. And I just wonder how that reflects in the next election and leading up to it. In your administration, if you look at the accounts of what you just told us, very successful in many ways. Whether people want to have these types of successes, if they're not, equally balanced in as I said, averagarian way, does it make the cut or not?
Yeah, so I think the U.S. political situation system, many folks probably in the room know it well with the primaries and the fact that oftentimes primary turnouts are not that great, and so it encourages sort of the more rabid base to come out and to participate, and so people they perceive themselves having to sort of cater, and to the politicians perceive they have to cater to the extremes, and that has, I think has been one of the challenges. You'd say, but there's always a pendulum, it swings back and forth. I think objectively, if you look at it, the pendulum has swung. When it goes to the left, it swings halfway back to the right, and then a little bit further to the left again. And we have one of the challenges I mentioned earlier, which is the issue focused really on the press, and I believe the press is in a democracy serves an absolutely critical role of questioning both sides. You can't end up having one side constantly being hammered and being asked all sorts of tough questions, and another side not ever being asked questions, certainly not ones that might prove embarrassing. And so that has been a dimension. I know in Switzerland you end up having far more stable with the federal council, the way that's set up, and the rotation of leadership. So there's many times I think where many of us in the States would like to have the system sort of self-moderate a little bit and move us. When people look and say, well, what do you think happens here? Well, we're still more than 18 months out from the next election, and I think if you looked at it back in 2016 at this point, or 2015, I guess it would have been, Scott Walker was the former Wisconsin governor, was the front runner in the Republican primaries at the time. I don't even think he made it through the third primary. So a lot can change between now and then. I think there's many of us who would really love to see a little more stability, would love to not have things so polarized and drawn to the extremes. But I think the American people innately are a decent people, and I think they can't be fooled forever. I think there's times where people wish things were some way, but ultimately they end up having to deal with the reality of the situation, and I think some of this behavior, this extremist behavior, is going to be weeded out over the course of the next few years.
Well, that's a very it's not quite yet a closing remark, but gives us a lot of hope. But I thought, Ulrich, we open up for questions at this juncture before you make some concluding remarks, and before I thank you for your insight. I think what I take away from it is, irrespective of the public perception which seems to govern our daily lives as to how well we're doing in the court of public opinion, you can get stuff done if you put the right attitude into it, if you lead with yes, if you don't let failure ever define who you are, because failure will only be written at the end of the book and not sort of at the beginning or in the middle. I think it was incredibly refreshing. But we said we want to open up for questions, given that we have a record attendance, and I see hands jumping up. So there's a microphone in here.
Should I stand up or? Oh. Hi, my name is Sabrina. I'm a resident here in Zurich. I had a question for you, however, about illegal immigration on the southwest border, as I'm from Arizona originally. So Title 42 just dropped. We haven't yet really seen any sustaining effects yet, or we'll see that sort of build up. If you were currently still in your position of counselor, or if you were sec state or even president at this time, what sort of recommendations would you try to enact or policies to solve what's currently a threat? And do you think maybe it's too late?
So, I think the story of the southwestern border is a failure on the part of the American government over the course of 30, 40 years. There's been no meaningful legislation updating to recognize the reality that exists. And if you don't mind, may take a minute here or two to delve into it a little bit, because it really needs to be understood, sort of how that plays itself out. So you hear a lot about, unaccompanied adults coming. You hear about the Flores Amendment. You hear about, Title 42. You hear about a bunch of different things. Let me describe sort of how we approached it. American, as I said, immigration law has not been updated. And so judges over time have essentially issued interpretations, their interpretations of the law that exists, and obviously built on conditions that have changed dramatically. We came to the conclusion, and we literally had 2 or 3 times the size of the United States Army coming across illegally when we were brought in, and we came to the conclusion that it wasn't in the best interest. In lots of visits, it was not in the best interest of these migrants. The sexual exploitation, the trafficking, the drugs, horrible conditions. Anyone who would encourage someone to undertake that travel from way down south in Central America or even further south to come, it was inhumane to encourage that type of behavior. And yet you had this magnet up north, and so we said we got to shut off the magnet. And so actually that was one of the things that Secretary Pompeo, he had a conversation with Foreign Secretary Ebrard in Mexico, and he sent me down there and said, Ulrich, you got to explain to them that we are going to shut down the border, and that they have got to shut down their southern border. Most people don't realize Mexico has some very, strict border rules, and they just ignore them. And so for 3 days in Mexico City, I sat across the table from Foreign Secretary Ebrard and explained to him that it was going to happen, whether he liked it or not. Very uncomfortable conversations, and I'll explain sort of the fast forward, but we became convinced that we needed to shut off the magnet and then work with the countries to bring the economic development and the like, because denuding them of their people, of their resource, wasn't the right answer. If the word asylum is used all the time, and if I did a little poll here, I bet you nobody in this room would know the 2 legitimate reasons for seeking asylum in the United States. They are suffering from political persecution and suffering from religious persecution. There is absolutely no means, legal means, for seeking economic asylum, and yet 99.9% of the people coming are economic asylees. People who may have been politically persecuted in El Salvador are certainly not being politically persecuted in Mexico. There is no legal right to come into the United States. And I would offer as evidence of that the fact that administrative law judges that adjudicate these asylum claims, 95% of the time, when a claim comes to the court and the people show up, the claim gets rejected. So you gotta somehow start to deal with either we are a country of laws and we believe in them, or we're not. And I, for one, believe that the Western way of life is predicated on that. That's how you build higher quality of life, and how you really can ensure that human rights are not violated, obeyed, et cetera. So what would we do? You asked the practical thing. the Remain in Mexico policy that we negotiated needs to come back in place immediately. I'll give you a little vignette. So I mentioned that I was very involved in the US Expo in Dubai. So that ultimately, even though it's Expo 2020, it actually was in 2022 that it ended, in March of 2022. And we had our National Day, and I was invited to go back and see that because I'd been very involved in setting it up. So I went by the Mexican pavilion, I took some pictures, and sent them to Foreign Secretary abroad. I actually should go back a sec. The last time I saw him prior to leaving the administration was in December of 2020 for a bilateral meeting on a totally different topic. He pulled me aside at the end and he said, Ulrich, I want to apologize to you, and I want you to let Secretary Pompeo know, let Mike know that I apologize to him too. And I said, for what? He said, because I was such a pain for you to work with, 2 years ago when we were putting the Remain in Mexico policy in place. And I said, he said, no, Ulrich, you don't understand how much better we have it in Mexico now. He said, we believe that we have taken about 25% of the cash flow away from the cartels because they had to shut down their southern border. Because very quickly they realized that if they don't have the relief valve to let the illegal immigrants come into the U.S., they were going to be stuck with them. So they very quickly had to shut it down. He said, we think we've done away with about 25% of the cartel cash flow, and we've regained control of almost 30% of the Mexican countryside. All right, so he was very pleased at that point and apologized. So I talked to him then when I sent this picture of the Mexican pavilion to him, and the note I got back from him essentially said, Ulrich, we wish Remain in Mexico were in place. He said, we're back to having these huge trails of people, and it's almost like the plague of locusts in the Bible, where when they go through these caravans, leave huge mess, and there's all sorts of human suffering. Any rate, so that's the first point, is to reinstall Remain in Mexico, and the second is to update our immigration laws. If the country wants to create economic asylum, well, then we have to create it through a legal mechanism. There needs to be that put on the book of laws. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you for your response.
Hi, Ulrich. My name is Chris. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the Taiwan topic and keep it as open as possible so you can give your thoughts.
Yeah. People want to sort of look at, I think, various geopolitical things and pretend they're not related or don't want to see the connections. There were a lot of different aspects. I think that the Chinese have, for a long time, it's no surprise to anybody, for a long time have viewed Taiwan as being part and parcel, and have had their eyes, especially as Taiwan's economic and semiconductor success has grown, and they realize, the Chinese Communist Party realizes that, he who controls or she who controls semiconductors has a big step forward in impacting the world. I think the Chinese have looked very closely at what the Russians, the way they have reacted and what's happened as Russia moved into Ukraine, and they've looked at the West, and I think, frankly, they have found, certainly with regard to America's response, have found it to be somewhat slow and muted. I think that emboldens the Chinese. I mentioned earlier that one of the tenets that we really believe strongly in is really returning to the days of peace through strength. That is what serves the interests of freedom and democracy best. One of the economic initiatives that we undertook was to work with TSMC, the leading Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturer, to have them open their next set of fabs in Arizona. So we had the last question come from a former Arizonan, because we realized that we just cannot be dependent on stuff that is that in that type of a precarious state. So I hope that that we're able to reestablish deterrence and send the right messages. It's quite frankly, I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time in Germany. It's frankly, that was the primary argument I made with the German foreign ministry and then the national security advisor there, reminding them that none of the European nations had the ability to project power meaningfully into Asia, that the Europeans had to take a larger role in their own defense because some of the resources that we historically have been able to deploy to Europe were going to have to be redeployed to deal with the thing. Thankfully, I think you see the Australians, I think you see the Japanese, I think you see the Koreans, the South Koreans, all have taken note and I think are making significant steps forward to help defend themselves as well. So I think the embedded question is what happens in Taiwan, and I think the answer is don't know, but I know if we pretend that the world is all good and ignore it, it's not going to get better.
As a follow-up to that, in a recent CNN interview, President Trump said that he would resolve Ukraine in 24 hours. Can you give us an idea of how you would go about it? I mean, he clearly has all the willpower to apply strength.
I have made a habit of not trying to get into other people's minds.
Okay, good.
So I don't know what might be lurking. I sure would love if he were able to do that, right? But you know, I think what he's really probably sort of saying is, look, you got to be serious about it. And you know, I mean, you could see very easily, you know, a year and a half ago, or it's not that long. So what was it? Maybe 12 months ago. You know, President Biden was all, you know, no tanks, no nothing, and then 9 months later, you know, here's how many tanks we're sending. I mean, it seems like we're constantly reacting as opposed to setting the ground rules and helping folks understand that this is acceptable, this isn't. I mean, his comment early on when the invasion was sort of poised and people knew that blood banks had been moved forward and you were seeing things that just don't normally happen. You know, I think President Biden made some comment about, well, it depends on how far in they come. That's not deterrence. That's, you know, giving someone carte blanche. So the deterrence model, I think, has served the West well. And when we failed to deter, when we've appeased, read World War I, World War II, results have been disastrous. I just, you know, would encourage us to look back at history, what works and what doesn't.
Martin?
Hi, Ulrich. Martin, great to see you again.
Good to
we
see
hosted you about 4 years ago. Swiss American Chamber of Commerce. Fantastic to have you back. I would like to follow on the Ukraine. We have a narrative here in our media that America gets tired of supporting Ukraine, and especially the Republican Party would, you know, would discontinue or at least lessen the support on Ukraine. So first question is, how do you see the way forward with Ukraine after next election? And second, I mean, you have a lot of experience. How do you see a way out of the Ukraine quagmire? Thank you.
Yeah. Martin, great to see you again. I mean, you described it accurately. I mean, it's a quagmire, right? There's no way anybody wins in this situation. I mean, the country's decimated. It's going to take untold, you know, trillions of dollars to to rebuild. I mean, it's a, you know, a mess. I think the Republican Party, you've got two factions. And frankly, I think you'd find that's one of the places where Secretary Pompeo probably differs with, you know, with President Trump at this point, because I think, you know, his view, and I subscribe to that as well, is that, you know, you can't just abandon Ukraine to the Russians. It sends all the wrong messages, forget Russia, but all the wrong messages to the Chinese. And if you're trying to establish deterrence, you can't say, oh, sometimes deterrence is important, sometimes it isn't. If it's convenient for me, I'll deter. If it isn't, I won't. It's either a policy and an attitude that, you know, that matters or that doesn't. So I don't know. I mean, that's going to be something that's going to be fought out in the coming front. It's pretty clear that because it happened on President Biden's watch, at least verbally and eventually with the checkbook, he has sort of signed up for, you know, for supporting Ukraine. Having said that, you know, I think, and I don't know the latest facts, so I'm not going to throw the multiple, but America has certainly contributed significantly more to the Ukraine than Europe has. And at some point, Americans are going to start asking, all right, we have this mass invasion in the South. We've got drug problems like nobody's business. Why are we, if people in Europe don't care enough about what's going on, why do we care? And I'm not suggesting that that's going to be the American population as a whole, but there's a portion of it that's very quickly going to ask the question, you know, there's a lot of people in Appalachia that would like a little more social spending. So, I mean, it's, the next few months will be, next, you know, few quarters will be very interesting.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm now Short Carter. India has taken over China, or the most populous country in the world. And India is part of the Quad with Japan,
Yep.
US, and UK, trying to mitigate Chinese rise. At the same time, India also part of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and they're trying to create common currency and bilateral trade and try to somehow marginalize US dollar. Now, India also good friends of United States, a brother or sister democracy, largest democracy in the world. How do you see American and Indian relationship going in, the directions where US can prevail?
Yeah, so I actually, our former ambassador there, a gentleman by the name of Ken Juster, and I worked very closely because, frankly, there's an immigration and issue associated. There's an awful lot of Indian citizens who came to the United States, overstayed visa, and so during the COVID years, there was all sorts of issues and challenges. You know, so my sort of view of the relationship is probably somewhat dated, but I know that Ambassador Juster and the team really made some major headways. In fact, so much so, and it was important, right, for President Trump and his team to say, look, we said we were going to, you know, take the following actions with folks that were breaking our laws. We're going to do that. And so literally before people could even give you an idea of the strength and the respect in the relationship, Prime Minister Modi literally allowed repatriation flights for Indians that were illegally in the United States to be flown back into India before domestic flights in India were going. And this was during COVID. So, I mean, there clearly was an understanding of, hey, you know, we're in it when times are good, we're also in it when times are bad, and we got to deal with it. You know, I know what I was going to say earlier, when I lost my train of thought there, and it had to do a little bit with the accessibility. I don't know, and I don't pretend to know the amount of dialogue that's going back and forth, but what I was going to say there earlier was, literally, I had sort of unplugged myself from DC, but I would periodically get phone calls from folks that I had worked with very closely. And one night I got a very agitated phone call from a European ambassador who said, Ulrich, what do I got to do to get my phone call returned? And I said, what do you mean? I said, you know, Ambassador X, you know, I've been long gone. He said, and he's calling me on my personal cell phone. He said, no. He said, I've been trying for weeks, and I can't get anybody to return my call. He said, and you and I, we didn't always see eye to eye together, but I had your personal cell phone, and you know I called you sometimes at 2 o'clock in the morning. But we didn't necessarily agree, but at the end I knew where you stood, and I knew why you stood there. And I said, that's what allies do. Friends don't always agree, allies don't always agree, but you communicate so that there's no thing. So I don't know sort of where things stand right now in the relationship, you know, and how much communication there is. But I think with some of the other challenges that have gone on, I think there certainly hasn't been as much, you know, personal diplomacy at the highest levels as we engaged in even during COVID.
I think we're overrunning a little bit, even though I certainly could go on for a long time. But you know what came out clearly from your remarks, Ulrich, is that trying to think creatively and solve problems intelligently does require personal relationships. The American Swiss Foundation is built on the very fact that people who meet each other, get to know each other, get to know their values, have open debate, are not shy of addressing the issues, get further in life in understanding each other. It's not for no reason that the exports of Swiss goods to the United States has surpassed that to China is about 3 times as high as the one to Germany, 3 times as high as the one to China, because we've gotten to know each other, because you grew up on the farm to behave well at a young age and then return to the United States. But each of us in this room has a story to tell about his or her experience in the United States. And that's what matters, because that's the basis of trust. And I go back to what I said at the beginning, whether it's artificial intelligence, 90% of what's available in data has been created in the last 2 years in a world that is incredibly polarized, that is incredibly biased, that is incredibly difficult to really understand what the truth is, how you can actually be reliable in your beliefs and where you get your information from. And if you see eye to a person, irrespective of political color or association, etc., and you get a feel about the man Ulrich Brechbühl, you have a better feel leaving this room, understanding what he's all about. I am so convinced, it's been my mantra all my life, that if I need to get something done, since I'm not James Bond, I have to disappoint you, I need to travel, I need to get to know people, I need to be in the room, I need to do the talking, and hopefully over time people will look at me as someone who's acted in a principled and prepared way. And I think that's what I took away from your remarks. But I thank you very, very much for having come here. We now, I believe, have apéro, as we say in Switzerland, and I'm sure you're gladly answering any other question, but I thought it was terrific, eye-opening, and going to the basis of what builds any human relationship, which is looking into each other's eyes and having a feel that we can trust them. So with that, a round of applause for you.
Thank you.
And of course, we cannot be in Switzerland and not give out chocolate. So Ulrich, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
It was great.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.